to understand the issues, the core reasons, what this might mean to your businesses, to your customers, to your customer support operations, and potentially your products. So hence today, we're delighted to have some key industry experts, particularly Ali Renison from the Institute's directors, Steve Bartlett from the AFSS, plus some expert panel guests, Richard and Peter. Thank you again, and Steve, for joining us to really assist on the various Q&As. So we're really pleased our events attracted media attention as well today. So please note, as you will see, we are recording this and we'll circulate it with the slides, really to ease socializing the information across all the different memberships and subsequent follow-up actioning. So you can, the great news is you can actively listen and participate rather than spend so much time note-taking. So finally, just a few key housekeeping points. Thank you for going on to mute. Please just stay on mute and just come up off mute if you just like to have to raise a question in the Q&A session. Please also it's just for the number of people we've got on this is phenomenal. Please just use the raise hand facility and obviously remember to lower it afterwards. But please do take the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A session. You know, this is your session, but I appreciate some are not always so comfortable, and if you'd rather key them in, then please use the chat facility and I'll do my best to sort of keep an eye and actually raise them. And if you'd like me for them to be unattributed, then do please let me know in that chat session. Usual Microsoft Teams best practice for everything here. And also, you know, we arranged this over lunchtime, so if you are, please enjoy your lunch, but do keep video switched off so we don't get too jealous. Given that we've also had quite a surge in interest above our expectations, there is a possibility that we may overrun by 10 to 15 minutes maximum. So I hope that's okay, but we do understand if you have got something prior, but obviously some of the, what comes up in the Q&A and the closing information from Bill is very valuable. So I hope you can check. So, and finally, obviously any feedback on today's session, please go via the marketing invite email. And as I said, please make sure you're all on mute, just with respect for our presenters as well. And I will now hand over to our chair of our our post-Brexit working party, and that's Bill Pugsley, who will chair this. And I just noticed a couple of you are not on mute, so if you could kindly just do that, please, that would be great. Thank you. So I'll hand it over to Bill. Yeah, thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Kevin. During this session, we hope to explore the challenges and impact on trade, critical upcoming dates, and how business software developers, our customers, and the onward supply chain are impacted by what Brexit is doing to us. We'll particularly focus on dates because Brexit isn't done and the implications of not being ready, VAT, zero tariffs, customs interfaces post-Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol, challenges for software providers to support trade, how such practicality affects your customers' businesses and how you can further help them, available support and resources. At the end of the presentations, we will then open the floor to questions. And as Kevin has noted, those questions can be dealt with as an offline chat or raising the hands. Please don't go to offline chat or raising your hands during the presentations because we won't be able necessarily to monitor them. To move on, because we've got a lot to get through today, I'd like to start by welcoming Steve Bartlett, Chairman of the Association of Freight Software Suppliers. Steve has a hell of a background in the IT infrastructure and transformation with expertise in predictive data analytics, robotic process and desktop automation and customer front interfaces. His role as chairman of the AFSS brings together and represents many of the leading suppliers of software to the freight and transportation industry. He will be talking today on systems experience of Brexit and the plans for the future. Thank you very much. I would now introduce Steve to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. What I thought I would do is to give you an idea of where we were towards the end of last year and what our position was in 2020 as we approached the Brexit deadline. We did have a significant number of changes to both existing systems and a whole raft of new systems that were being introduced as a part of the EU exit. And this did put a huge strain and pressure onto the software developers, my members in the freight industry. One of the issues we often faced was that many changes were actually done with little or no consultation. So we had a problem where we were often having to rework things, and changes to systems came as a bit of a surprise to us as we approached the end of the year. But in general terms, we were fairly confident that we would be ready for all the changes that would happen to these systems, with the exception of the new Customs Declaration Service, known as CDS. Now, for those who don't know what that is, CDS is the replacement for the current Chief system, which is the main declarations system for HMRC. Now, we agreed a plan with HMRC to roll out this CDS product at the end of 2019, actually. But some point early in April, I can hear myself. It's terrible. Just wait till someone goes on mute. That's better. Thank you. But about April, May time this year, it was announced that CDS would be the de facto system for Northern Ireland. The reason for this was because CDS as a system is not only Unified Customs Code compliant, UCC compliant, but it was able to handle the two sets of tariffs that may be required for trade going to Northern Ireland, and this is something that Chief can't do. But we had an issue with rolling this out by the end of the year or at the end of the year, because we felt that we would not be ready, and we made it known to HMRC and went public that most of my members wouldn't be ready to deliver this product for Northern Ireland. Main reasons were that the final CDS update was actually not delivered until early December, so this was just too late to test and deploy this in time for the end of the year. And the fact that CDS was still an unproven product, and some of the export elements were not working. So there was a lot of reputational risk for my members to release this without proper testing. So the main advice to traders was to sign up and use the TSS service, which was in the new service. This is the Trader Support Service, the new service that HMRC have created to handle Northern Ireland trade. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. So that was how we felt towards the end of last year. So how did it all go? Well, we did see a number of new systems being introduced. We saw the Goods Vehicle Movement Service, the GVMS it's known as, and this is for truck movements moving from Europe to the Great Britain. It's a system that will be introduced for all trade in July, but from the 1st of January, it's only being used for Northern Ireland trade only. We saw safety and security. This was a commonly shared system with the EU, but then had to be split into two separate systems. One called Safety and Security GB and one called ICS Northern Ireland. So we had two systems now to deal with for safety and security declarations. We also had the new check an HGV is ready to cross the border, probably the longest name for an application ever. But this was, although AFSS and my members didn't really have anything to do with this system, it wasn't. We weren't interfacing with this at all. This was a new system that was brought into being. This is to provide access for vehicles before they go to the ports at Kent, to make sure they have all the paperwork correct and ready. We also saw a number of existing systems being changed. We saw the main declaration system Chief, for example, and there was a number of changes that were required in Chief to take account of the changes and the staged implementations that were going to happen. CDS itself was changed in December to take account of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And we saw a number of changes also to the transit system of NCTS and the excise system EMCS. So there were a number of changes that happened as the clock turned from the 31st of December to the 1st of January. So if I could have the next slide, please. So how did it all go? Well, actually, it went without too many issues. I will call out some exceptions. But all systems went live, and we were quite, I think everyone was quite fortunate in that at the beginning of the year, the volumes of traffic moving, freight moving across the border was extremely low. And so that was fortunate in some respects. Getting a lot of background noise. We had the Border Process Delivery Group, the BPDG, did start a set of daily calls with all the trade to give us updates on border status, systems statuses, and allowed us to ask any questions as we went along. And this has proved to be very helpful. But it has actually given us updates on a number of on the status at the borders every day. And we did see some problems in systems, but this was mainly in the first couple of weeks of the year. We saw some systems with HMR systems, but also with EU customs systems. There were some issues with the French customs system and also with the Irish one as well. But this seemed to be identified and resolved quickly by HMRC or workarounds in place. We had some synchronization issues as well between the HMRC and EU, which caused some vehicles going into what they call the orange lane, which is the inspection lane in the French ports. To date, the only system really that's causing us some severe issues is the transit system known as NCTS. When there are a number of issues, not only around how NCTS is actually used, but there are issues around technical issues in terms of timeouts and problems like that. And this is causing the most disruption to us at the moment. Fixes are going in and workarounds are going in place, but we are still seeing significant issues with this particular system. At the border process daily call, we were introduced to a brand new term called turnbacks. And this is the term that's used for vehicles that are turned back or not allowed to board the ferry because of one reason or another. And at the beginning of the year, we saw nearly 1 in 5 vehicles being turned back. And the split was between COVID-related issues, so if the driver hadn't had a test, for example, but also another half of that was at least down to documentation issues. But we've seen recently this dropped to about 4% and 5% currently. As I said, this is a 50-50. It's about a 50-50 split, we're told, between COVID-19 testing and incorrect paperwork. So the amount of turnbacks has dropped significantly, but it did start out the year quite high. We learnt that the Trader Support Service, this is the service for Northern Ireland, for traders to use for Northern Ireland, isn't actually using CDS as a system yet. Everything at the moment is summary declarations. So supplementary declarations or full declarations will be required in February, and that is due to start in the next week or two. And that is going to be a significant challenge, we feel, for the Trader Support Service. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So where are we at, and where are we moving to? So it's our belief that really, from a technical perspective, that the issues are there, but they're not are being resolved, or they're not that significant. We think that there are far greater challenges at the moment in the understanding of the new processes and the procedures than there are in the systems that support this. We feel that if the system is there and it works, so long as the right information and the right data is used in the right fields, and that is the problem. There seems to be a lot of issues with the trade themselves and understanding what the new processes are and what they need to put in the different fields. I believe that more cracks may appear as the volumes return to normal. We're being told that volumes are returning to near normal as expected for this time of year. Something like 80%, I think it was 70% of normal January traffic, but obviously some of that shortfall is down to the current coronavirus lockdown and things like that. For AFSS, as a trade body, I've received numerous inquiries from traders looking for software to enable them to do the declarations themselves. I think they've discovered that perhaps a bit too late that they now have to do declarations for all their goods, and finding that the intermediary market or freight forwarders are so saturated right now with additional work that they're not taking on new customers. So consequently, a lot of traders are thinking, well, if I don't do that many shipments per year and it's the same sorts of things each time, then why don't I try and do it myself? And so they are making inquiries from AFSS members for the software to enable it to do it themselves. In terms of CDS, and we are actually beginning to see a number of AFSS members successfully migrating customers to CDS, which is good news. And we are actively engaged with HMRC on the plans for migration in 21 and 22. And we're also looking at there's going to be a whole raft of changes to be required towards July as the staged implementation period ends. So there will be a lot of work between now and July to get the systems ready for that. However, what I will say, as I sort of finish up, we've talked to HMRC about migrating customers to CDS. Technically, we don't feel this is going to be. We feel this is perfectly possible, but we are trying to make sure that HMRC are taking readiness to move to CDS as a whole, because there are significant issues that traders are currently facing, as I've described before, in terms of coping with EU exit issues, and to thrust a new system on them right now is something that they could well do without. So we're trying to make sure that they consider that in their decisions as to when the traders need to be moved to CDS and they can finally close Chief down. So that sort of concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. We really appreciate your valuable input and especially your time today. As noted earlier, as we will keep noting, please hold questions until we reach the end of the day, although there will be an opportunity to answer some questions shortly. I'd now like to welcome Ali Renison, I do apologise, Ali, Head of EU and Trade Policy Institute of Directors. Ali, we're very grateful for your time, given the amount of time you're spending trying to help our government understand the issues of what international trade really means and what the Brexit agreement has done for us. Ali will finish her presentation today with a short panel discussion where she will be joined by Richard Asquith, VP Global Indirect Tax Alvara, and Peter McSweeney, Chairman of Agency Hector Management UK Limited, who will join her. Richard is responsible for legislative policy strategy at Alvara, helping businesses understand major changes in VAT rules on selling goods and services in Europe and around the world. Peter is also chair of the Joint Customs Consultative Committee Working Group. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you, everyone. Good to be here. And as I mentioned, we're going to have, I'm going to foreshorten my presentation just a little bit to let Richard speak on the sort of to the VAT issues in particular, because I know that we've had quite a few questions about the sort of general differences on that. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So just looking at sort of the patterns that we've found, and I think that, you know, to some extent we could have a discussion separately about the reasons for that. But, you know, I think sort of Steve mentioned that one of the issues that we've always said, that I think government has always said to some extent, is that, yes, there were concerns about to what extent the actual infrastructure and systems might be ready, but that really the challenge lay in making sure that people who are trading with the EU, and not, by the way, you know, one of the key issues is that we're not going to get into too many non-customs, non-logistics, non-sort of VAT related issues today, but beyond that, clearly, there are changes even for domestically operating businesses, for example, in chemicals, even though most chemicals businesses do tend to trade, we know that, for example, that there's going to be domestic regulatory regimes that are being set up, even if you trade domestically, simply because they were previously done by the EU. So we've always had a sort of solid about a third chunk of members who said that they just could not prepare fully, certainly in time, for the agreement. And I think COVID made that much more significantly difficult in terms of sort of day-to-day business survival. And the government did publish a fair amount before we had the agreement, but a lot of that separate to the border operating model, which I would, if you really want sort of to understand the exact nature of what's going on at the border or what to expect at the border, but B, also to get a sense of what the differences are, because the idea that the UK government had in place was that it really wasn't going to have a big difference between UK and EU trade at the border. Although I do think that there were some provisions that were obviously came through the agreement. There were a lot of businesses, I think, that were expecting to some degree that the trade agreement was going to effectively sort out a lot more than it did. And the UK, we can see from the agreement clearly meant it when it said that it was going to be a third country. It wanted nothing necessarily more than third country arrangements. But as we've seen in a number of areas, the EU's sort of third country regimes just aren't really set up for countries that are that closely integrated. So I think that really sort of had a number of sort of constellating factors that crashed into each other for why businesses had such a challenge. Because while we knew that, there were going to be customs declarations, and the government had already published separately that we were not going to have the full customs declarations for imports, at least. Trying to understand what that meant, particularly I think from an outbound export perspective, was quite difficult without actually having not only the text, the agreement, but actually having the guidance attached to it. So without going over too much old ground, we obviously had the agreement that was published about, it was Christmas Eve, but a lot of the guidance to try and help firms understand that, because unless you're a trade lawyer, you're not going to understand that kind of text, didn't really sort of dribble in until some of it even after January 1st. So that's, I'm just going to close that because that's, I can't see. The difficulty, I think, in terms of one of the things that we've found in respect of how businesses are looking at planning and were looking at planning and preparation was they constantly said that tariffs was the top issue that they were worried about. And I think while to some degree, that reflected the concern of what tariffs would have done, and I think they would have obviously made these arrangements much more difficult, it was one of the most easiest to understand for businesses. It's sort of a static factor to some extent, even though tariffs are often changing in different contexts. It was people understood what that was going to be. They could calculate the cost issues from a cash flow management perspective, but understanding the detail of the non-tariff sort of customs and VAT related issues. There were some, I think, that were hoping for more, let's say, in the way of, even though the UK outside of the EU's VAT area, is pretty sort of finite and absolute. I think there were people that were hoping for more facilitations that probably came through the agreement. I have to say that actually in the agreement itself, there weren't a huge amount of facilitations that some might have expected.
Ali seems to be on mute.
Ali, you've gone to mute. We've lost the last minute of your presentation.
Don't know how that happened. Sorry. So what we saw really in the run-up to the sort of 31st of January was that a lot of businesses had either stockpiled or actually, particularly actually some businesses we know that were affected by the Northern Ireland Protocol just decided to sort of temporarily halt trading. And as those sort of freight volumes sort of start to return to normal, I think, the title of the event is heading toward the perfect storm. There are other sort of pinch points that we're approaching in the next not only weeks but also months ahead, and it's yet to be seen whether some businesses have actually decided to change their shipment routes. We know that the UK is no longer really significantly being used as a land bridge for people who are coming from Ireland, traversing the UK and going on to continental Europe. There's different shipment routes that are being used. You've heard about the issues, for example, with Scottish seafood in the media headlines. So, for example, some fishermen are because I think particularly it's not just from an outbound outbound perspective. From an inbound perspective, a lot of people who are buying from the UK or selling to the UK we're also very much not ready. I think actually trade readiness on the EU side has been a significant challenge, and that's actually leading to people just wanting to halt trade with the UK, not in huge numbers, but certainly enough examples to be significant. And then the last thing I would say before we go into some of the more substantive issues is that, you know, a lot of businesses are finding out that the word free trade agreement could be a bit misleading. You know, it's free trade if you're starting from a point of really non-integration. Obviously, for the UK, this is doing the opposite. So next slide, please. I'm going to speed through that. It's just sort of, and I'm sure the slides will be sent out afterwards. We often use this chart to sort of re-emphasize to businesses that there's so many different ways in which you can be impacted. And, you know, a lot of businesses do not act the way that government departments work, which is sometimes to have a slightly siloed, you know, customs is dealt by a certain department, VAT is held. Well, technically by HMRC, it's indirect tax, but sort of very often the two don't often intersect the way that companies look at this. So there's lots of different ways in terms of looking at supply chain management that we had asked businesses to do before the transition period ended, but certainly now I think things like rules of origin are certainly leading to not only some adjustments, but actually structural changes in businesses for how they set themselves up and whether and to what extent and how they trade with the EU. Next slide, please. So I'm going to sort of speed through till we get to the more substantive slides. But really, one of the things that we've found, it was a slight issue within the single market, a slight issue within the customs union, but never to, I think, to the extent that companies are now seeing the impact, which is that, you know, while we have a customs union and single market, which means that certainly within the EU, within these sort of structures, if you're trading with other countries, there's uniformity, at least arguably, apart from some things around excise, uniformity with respect to procedures for how we do trade in goods, particularly with the rest of the EU. We've always said that from a planning and now obviously adjustment point of view that, you know, we're starting to find that the lack of consistent implementation, particularly now that the UK is a third country, even though on paper there are certain procedures that are laid down formally for how EU countries trade with what we are now, the third country, the implementation of that, particularly at ports, you know, the expectation of how challenging or how facilitative different customs and border authorities are going to be is really differing. And so that's why we've always encouraged businesses to do enough due diligence that they actually reach out to some of those customs and regulatory authorities to understand, because even though it's technically a single market, a single customs union, there are obviously going to be variations in implementation. And so it really sort of defaults back to having to, not just for services, but for goods, make sure that you are engaging with the authorities in those different countries. And for rules of origin and sort of there will be easements, but we'll come on to that separately. I will slow down. I can see people asking me to slow down. It's just we've got a lot to get through. So next slide, please. So from a customs standpoint, you know, when it comes to, I think, you know, the EU is going to be implementing full border control measures now. So businesses who are exporting goods from the UK to the EU will need to meet all those kind of relevant export requirements. And so in terms of preparation and adjustment, you know, for businesses that may be looking at this for the first time, it's really important to determine whether your business has the responsibility for imports or exports in the supply chain. And this is where that kind of Incoterms, a lot of businesses may not have had Incoterms in their contract for goods trade simply because we were within the EU, so there was no necessarily responsibility for paying different sort of import and export costs. And those kind of reflect the buyer and seller responsibilities appropriately. We hope by now that most businesses have obtained and have the necessary EORI numbers. But clearly that's something, because now there's a slight difference in how EORI numbers are obtained, particularly if you're trading with Northern Ireland. You know, in terms of the customs regimes and simplifications, you know, customs authorizations can help businesses manage customs administration, obviously suspend duty costs if you are engaging with tariffs, if, for example, businesses don't want to have to deal with the rules of origin complexity and end up just paying the tariff. But so, for example, one of the simplifications.
Someone's muted Ali again. I
presume people can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay. So CFSP, for example, Customs Freight Simplified Procedures, they allow importers to import goods into the UK with kind of minimal administrations at the border. And there may be other custom regimes that are relevant to businesses moving goods across the borders multiple times, for example, due to consolidation of goods at a distribution center or for processing and repair to help manage potential additional duty costs that may arise. So, for example, inward and outward processing, I'm not going to go into the details of those, may be relevant. But businesses really, I think this is the key point on that, they need to factor in the lead time for obtaining authorization. So for example, the authorization process for CFSP can take up to 5 months. So it's just for people that may be looking at some of these authorizations. And as I mentioned on the EORI numbers now, we've had a couple of questions on this because obviously there's now a new EORI number for people who are moving goods under the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is the XI. And it still requires, I think, the questions that we're getting is, for example, a business that's based in GB, but that is using an EU EORI number or XI EORI number for goods that are moving from Northern Ireland, whether they can still use those numbers for then sort of onward sort of goods movements and trade with the continent. So HMRC actually has a helpline for a lot of these questions, so it's worth looking that up as well. And then there's obviously the Trader Support Service, which is for people who are moving goods under the Northern Ireland Protocol. We hope that people who are impacted by that did register ahead of time, but worth sort of looking at that. We'll probably get into the panel discussion separately, what the feedback on that has been, because I think there are some challenges around how the TSS is operating for some businesses. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip the VAT slide because we've got Richard with us. So on to the next one, please. Just briefly, on SPS, products of animal origin, I mean, this is obviously one of the areas we're seeing the most impact on because it's really an agreement that doesn't do a huge amount for businesses that are trading in agri-food products. There aren't a huge amount of preferential terms apart from the fact that we don't have tariffs. That's obviously significant because that was the area in which the UK and EU both have fairly, as most other countries do, high tariffs. But the EU's own sort of third country regime for what we call sanitary and phytosanitary products is pretty not designed for people that are fairly integrated like the UK and the EU are. And so now, for example, export health certificates are required for trade in sort of products of animal origin. There are a number of different grace periods and exemptions at the moment, some for the UK writ large. So, for example, they're distinguishing between sort of more processed manufactured goods, sort of bread, for example, that are going through supermarkets. But Northern Ireland has sort of different grace periods relating to the protocol. And obviously, they all need sign-offs from the vets before going into the EU market. We think that actually the vet capacity issue that people had been concerned about isn't as big as feared, but I think that there's a lot of focus on that, making sure that that doesn't crop up as an issue for when the grace periods expire. And there are different now regimes for how you manage, particularly from an imports and traceability perspective, agri-food products. So, for example, you need to do pre-notification for imports. We now use the UK IPAF system for imports, whereas the EU is obviously keeping the traces system that other traders may be used to dealing with when trading with the EU, but Northern Ireland is a slightly different regime that sort of sits across both. Next slide, please. So rules of origin, we could probably spend all day on this. I'm not going to, but it's, this is one of the reasons that we were pushing for the UK and the EU to maybe initially keep some tariffs aligned, import tariffs aligned, because it would have saved the headache of rules of origin that businesses are now facing, which is that basically that even though we have no tariffs with the EU, you now need to be able to prove that you qualify for that continued zero duty treatment. And there are general rules, and then there are product-specific rules, particularly by sector. I would say, by the way, and I will put it in the chat after I finish speaking, that there is a helpline. This is where I think the difference in departments can be a little bit of a challenge to navigate, because technically, while the negotiation responsibility for rules of origin should fall to the Trade Department, the implementation of that is falling to the BIS department, BAIS rather, excuse me. And it only applies to goods that qualify. So there's a whole list of kind of definitions that help businesses try and understand, complicated as it may be, whether you meet those processing rules. So you can either be wholly obtained in the sort of territories of the UK and the EU, or sort of substantially worked on, processed in those territories. And this is becoming a bit of a challenge for not only the food sector, but for example, the chemical sector as well, which is sort of heavily integrated from a trade perspective. And there's only really bilateral accumulation, which means that, generally speaking, if you have a lot of sort of content going into the goods that you're selling to the EU, for example, comes from outside of the UK or the EU, it's not going to count. And so this is leading businesses to try and really, even though there is some relief, which I'll come to in a minute, it's leading to some structural changes in how businesses are sort of setting themselves up and their own supply chains. Some businesses, I think, particularly in the manufacturing sector, may and are just choosing to pay the tariff because it's about, on average, 2 to 3%, but it's a much bigger headache, obviously, for agri-food businesses. You may have heard the example given by the chief exec of M&S recently for sort of Percy pigs, basically, effectively, to show that goods that are, for example, coming from Ireland or being repackaged in the UK going onto the continent or vice versa, that's becoming a huge headache. There is some relief in the way of an easement that the UK and the EU agreed to, basically, in terms of the proof of that declaration. You don't need those declarations at the time that goods are being exported for the next 12 months, but that isn't to say that you don't still have to do the paperwork. And that's sort of why I think it's still a challenge now for businesses, even though, and I think this is important, not all sort of countries in their trade agreements allow for self-certification, but traders are able to. Having said that, it's so complicated that a lot of people will need professional advice to sort of work that out for themselves. Next slide, please. And I'm going to come to the end shortly. The Northern Ireland Protocol, most of you probably are aware of it. What we're finding, generally speaking, is that, in the sense that Northern Ireland remains in the single market for goods effectively, while the UK is not only out, but isn't aligned to any EU rules, particularly in the agri-food space, the lack of that kind of UK-EU overarching agreement means that I think you're hearing a lot of the headlines about the complexity of sending agri-food products from Great Britain to Northern Ireland is quite significant. We don't want to sort of reach into too many sort of hysterics, but there have been headlines about, for example, products not just reaching Northern Ireland shelves. Some of that because people have decided that they're not going to supply ahead of time, or they stockpiled. Some of it, people are realizing the extent of the paperwork. There are grace periods there. So, for example, Northern Ireland has a grace period until people who are moving goods under the protocol have until April to not have to deal with export health certificates. And also a separate grace period, which is ending actually in probably a week in the next couple of days, around that sort of not having simplified customs declarations. Anyone who's using the Trader Support Service will now need to sort of submit supplementary declarations, i.e. the full enchilada, as I call it, by the 4th of February. But HMRC is currently working through options to try and sort of facilitate and mitigate that for businesses. But really, I think the impact here is around the lack of sort of trade readiness, particularly in Great Britain, who are selling products to Northern Ireland. So next slide, please. And the last thing I would say before handing over to Richard to do a sort of whistle-stop tour through VAT is that the UK government did reach a fair number of agreements with other countries to sort of try and replicate as far as possible the trade agreements that they had with them. In some areas, it's just around tariffs because the sort of services component, for example, trading with Norway or the EFTA countries couldn't be done until the UK-EU agreement was completed, and also the EU technically retains competence for some of those negotiations in services even as well. Turkey is the one I always throw up because, for those who are doing a lot of manufacturing trade with Turkey, the UK really had to wait for the deal to be done with the EU to sort of then do a trade agreement with Turkey. And I think it's very clear that particularly with Turkey, the trade agreement that they've sort of signed, which covers things like tariffs, is really a baseline that they're now going to sort of expand upon. There are some easements. So, for example, I think HMRC is continuing to accept the use of ATR forms for a limited time period, but this will very much be sort of subject to future negotiation. And this is where I think the tie-up between DIT and HMRC is really important to get right, quite frankly, because DIT does the negotiations, but in terms of how the customs authorities in different countries are implementing that, they're not always completely in tandem. So that's why really sort of checking with the customs authorities in those countries rather than just defaulting to what the text or the guidance says is so important. So I'm going to leave it there and hand over, I think, now to Richard, and hope to pick up some of this in the panel discussion afterwards.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Ali, for that intense but whistle-stop tour of so many issues. I'm luckily I only have to focus on VAT. Just very briefly, I work in tax technologies at Avalara, and we have about 15,000 businesses, EU, UK businesses, who are probably like you, trying to struggle with what on earth has gone on with Brexit, why are their goods stuck on the wrong side of the borders, who should they have paid VAT to, who can they reclaim it back from, and how to keep the tax authorities happy. So what I'll do now, just in the very short time I've got, 5 minutes or so, I will talk about what the changes were, who will it affect, and then go through some of the details. So the big headline, obviously, was after the end of the transition period, the UK, along also exiting the EU's customs union and the single market, also left the EU's VAT regime. That's a compulsory regime whereby we must follow rules set within Brussels by the member states into our own local VAT laws. So we're now free of that. Now, the two headlines that come out of that, what's changing now for UK businesses doing business across the English Channel, is
Helen,
that.
Sorry, Richard. Could you move the slide along, Helen, please?
Firstly, is that we lose a lot of the simplifications that made VAT compliance a little bit easier. So whether you're B2B, B2C, goods, services, you're basically probably going to need more VAT registrations, more VAT compliance, and we'll go into the details in a second. And then secondly, the messy, expensive business, if you don't manage it properly, of import VAT. Generally, B2B goods prior to the end of the transition period, where VAT's free, the movement across the English Channel, say from France, Germany into the UK. That's no longer the case. Import VAT will have to be paid. There are mechanisms to help you manage that. If you're careful about it, you must pick your country. You must make sure your freight forwarder understands what you're trying to do, and you must understand what your Incoterms are. So they're the big changes. More VAT compliance, more VAT registrations, and then secondly, you've got to take care of your import VAT. Who does it affect? It affects goods, primarily B2B goods and B2C goods. There's lots of changes there, import VAT and compliance to worry about. I'll come to those in a second. It does, though, also affect services. Not as much, it's the good news. On B2B services, there are very limited changes, which is good news. Mostly no VAT still to be charged on your invoices if you can get your customers' EU VAT number and vice versa. On services, there are some changes, some really interesting pitfalls. If you're selling specialized services to consumers in the EU, then suddenly you may face new VAT registration requirements. So let's go through some of the major changes and what you should be thinking about doing there. Ali's already talking about the big customs one, and I'd just reiterate, make sure you've understood the ERE question. One problem, and every day it feels like a new flavor or new problem as everybody tries to put back together their supply chains, is on ERE numbers. If you are exporting goods into the EU, make sure you've got a representative who can give you their ERE number, because a lot of businesses mistakenly went off UK businesses and got EU ERE numbers. They won't do for import declarations. So my inbox this morning is full of businesses stuck with that. But sticking to VAT, first of all, you're going to need more VAT registrations. Now, why is that? If you're B2B goods, you're given a couple of simplifications. We won't have time. Fortunately for you, I won't have to spoil your Friday afternoon explaining the intricacies of that. But in your supply chains, if you've been using things like triangulation and call-off stocks, if they're familiar to you, then you're going to need extra VAT registrations. That's on the B2B side. On the goods side, it's bad news, particularly in the e-commerce markets. Any business, small businesses in particular, but often medium-sized e-commerce businesses selling goods from the UK to consumers, will lose something called the distance selling threshold. Now, what that enables businesses to do is to sell goods using their UK VAT number until they had a certain limit of turnover in a particular country. So, for example, in Germany, it was 100,000 euros. In France, it's 35,000 euros. Now, this has really hit small e-commerce businesses or medium-sized e-commerce businesses because they're having to get instantly VAT registered now or stop selling. And you'll see in a lot of the stories in the newspapers about businesses on both sides being hit by the loss of this easement, this simplification, distance selling. It's the same on digital services. And I notice obviously that'll be relevant to some of our audience. If you're a UK business and you're selling to consumers and you're selling software online.
Someone's muted Richard.
Richard, you're mute. Richard, your screen is mute.
No, I think someone does that for me. I'll go back to digital services. If you're providing digital services to consumers around the EU, you've probably been using the wonderful single VAT returns called the MOS, Mini One-Stop Shop, around Europe. Now, you haven't lost that. You can still get one of those, but you can't do it anymore through HMRC. So go and get VAT registered somewhere like Ireland, cheap, easy, obviously the language benefits, and you can continue to report all your sales to EU consumers through your Irish MOS or any other country you may use. So just an extra registration there. Then just moving on a bit, because the UK HMRC thought we didn't have enough on our plates, I'm staying on e-commerce now for a moment, with Brexit, they've also reformed the e-commerce laws, and this won't affect UK businesses, it actually affects EU businesses and international sellers. They're now going to have to charge UK VAT on all of their imports for the first time. Previously, there was an exemption of just £15. If you were below that, then you could ship your goods into UK consumers. I imagine that's not going to affect many people here, so I won't dwell on that one. And I think then on services, just moving to services, as I said at the beginning, there isn't much of a change there. If you're selling B2B services of most types, and we call this the general rule in VAT language, then it remains zero rated. Instead of it being, and I'm going to flip into jargon now, instead of it being a zero rated intra-community supply of services, it's now an export of services. So it's outside of the UK VAT regime. But what you must do is get an EU VAT number from your customer. We've already talked about B2C goods, but B2C services, there is a landmine on this one that most people don't know about. If you're providing a very limited range of services to consumers in the EU, then you were given an exemption. You were allowed not to VAT register. That exemption has now gone. So the type of services I'm thinking of is very much the specialist services, so things like professional services, so accountancy, laws, architects, advertising, consulting, some staff, some types of financial services, so advice, those sorts of things. Then you've got to watch out. You're probably, if you've got a consumer, and we're seeing lots of people getting stung by this, selling software or architectural or land-related services to, for example, retirees in the different countries, then they end up getting having to get UK VAT registered. So the last point then is that we're always getting asked about all those extra VAT registrations. There's a new requirement because we're out of the EU VAT regime, where if you do have a foreign VAT registration in the EU, you're going to have a special type of VAT agent, a representative. We call them fiscal representatives. They're a bit of a nightmare because they share your tax liabilities with you. And as you can imagine, as a result, they want to protect themselves. So they'll often ask you for a bank guarantee or some kind of deposit. They'll want to sift through all your records to make sure that you're doing the French, German, or Polish VAT correctly. So it's cumbersome on you as well on them. Generally, about 17 countries impose this obligation on third countries, which obviously the UK is now. It's a very much a moving target, and if you look up, we have an interesting blog which we're keeping live, and we were just updating it this morning. It's called "Do I Need a Fiscal Representative After Brexit?" You'll see a list of all the countries there. Good news is overnight we heard that Sweden and Finland are now relaxing this, but we're still anxiously waiting on what Italy and Spain are going to do. So one more thing to worry about. So that very much covers the whirlwind tour. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Richard. And just for the benefit of others on the call, apologies. You can completely blame myself. Richard was going to just join for the panel discussion, but at short notice, I did ask him to do a quick whistle-stop tour, which is why there aren't any slides. But we will. There is a slide in this that I've provided in the slide deck that's being sent out, and I think we'll update with some of the information and the link to the blog that Richard and the guys at Avalar are doing. I'm just going to now ask that Steve and also Pete just go on camera, because we're going to have a quick chat before we hand back to Bill for any sort of audience questions. So I think I can see Richard, but I can't see Pete and Steve. If you wouldn't mind going on camera, I think that would be great. Either way, as long as you can hear me.
Yeah.
That's really hi Pete. I think I'll just sort of briefly actually turn to Pete. Pete's sort of really more here, I think, in his JCCC chair capacity, and for the benefit of people on the call, that's basically the trade chair of the working group with HMRC that some of us, myself and Steve, sit on for different organizations. I mean, Pete, I'm not going to get too specific, but I just wonder how you think how you think it's going at the moment, particularly from a your own role as a sort of as a CSP, from the back end side of things. We've got these kind of different, if you like, grace periods ending. There's one already next week for sort of Northern Ireland, and sort of with the simplified declarations. But I wonder how you're seeing people handling things like transit, things like sort of, are people making use of the simplified declarations? Is there going to be a big crush that you see come sort of July, when everything sort of is supposed to flip back to the full controls?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big change in July, Ali. I don't think people really. I've been staggered by how little people understand, actually. Even people that you think should know better, that are in the business. And I've also been surprised at how much devil there is in the detail, because the headline legislation looks relatively simple. Well, when you start drilling down, how do I actually do that? It suddenly becomes very complex, and although it might be in the border operating model, who reads that? I mean, give you some example. One of our users, who's an experienced broker, actually asked us the question: is my pre-lodgement entry I have to use for Ro-Ro traffic, is it the same as an ocean pre-lodgement? And you sort of think, well, of course it is. And but then you think, well, actually, yeah, should he assume that? And it is the same, but slightly different, and you have to arrive it differently. So all these little details are quite complex, and I think people are doing now. They've got used to what the existing regulations are, and they're assuming things like everyone's on EIDR. Yeah, don't worry about it. There's no checks at the border, so we have no idea of how much, of what level of compliance there is, and I suspect it's lower than it needs to be. And they're certainly not going to be equipped for the changes that come in April and July.
And how are you thinking, in terms of, this is sort of a live flowing picture with focus on, I guess, what we can control, which is HMRC. I mean, how are you finding the implementation and sort of live sort of development of some of these processes with HMRC, whether from a CSP perspective or, the engagement with trade itself?
Not too bad, I think. I don't know whether Steve would want to comment on this as well. I mean, I think they're reasonably consultative, but a lot of things are coming up that we spoke about, 18 months ago, and we think have been, dismissed or whatever, but they've been parked. And they come up again. Like, for instance, they look as though they're wanting to introduce the requirement to put the trailer or the vehicle registration number on the customs declaration. Now, that's really totally impractical. And we talked about that 18 months ago, and I thought that had been sort of kicked into the long grass, but it appears not to have been. So we don't always know what the what's bubbling away under the surface.
Yeah, and just before I come to Richard, sort of a final question, Steve, I just wonder if there's anything there that you were wanted to respond to.
No, I think I did agree with Peter. The consultation we've had with HMRC has been pretty good. I think that we all suffered towards the end of last year with the pressure of things to do, and some things got missed, or as I said in my presentation, there was some issues around things going ahead without any consultation. But I think that was, we were all under enormous pressure to deliver things for the end of the year, and I think that some things obviously got missed. But in terms, I'm fairly comfortable with the consultation we get from the government right now. And as Peter said, it does feel that they're beginning to listen to some of the things we've been talking about for some time now. And whereas the discussion on some items might have been taboo or it's just this isn't going to happen last year, now it's feeling like it might be a possibility.
Yeah. And I think that probably speaks, sorry, Peter, I think that probably speaks to the fact that we were in, for better or for worse, a negotiation sort of setting where it was quite difficult to get some of that really sort of engaged sort of feedback, two-way communication. But now sort of this is the baseline and they're trying to help implement it. But Peter, sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, I think all the focus was on making sure whatever we did was legal. Or as HMRC perceived it to be legal. Now I think they're concentrating slightly more on what works for business, I hope, because that's important. And what also doesn't help is the fact that they keep saying, no, this is going to come in at such and such a date, and take it to the wire, and then the week before they sort of say, well, okay, you can have a bit more time, or there's another easement, and that has not been helpful at all.
Yeah, the irony, of course, being that I think that that's such a headache for the people who are doing the important kind of back-end operational side of this. But you're getting a lot of, I think, the trade actually lobbying for some of these grace periods to be extended, for the easements to be extended, simply because they have to actually do this sort of compliance work as well. Richard, I just had a question. One of the things that, two questions really. One was around, one of the issues that we're seeing, for example, amongst some businesses is that because of this new requirement to, from a VAT perspective, to actually have to establish yourself or account for VAT now if you're selling from the EU to the UK, that people aren't, some businesses aren't just wanting to sell to the UK, they don't want to have to deal with it if they're not going through some of the big sort of marketplaces like Amazon, for example. And I just wonder if you're seeing any of that on your side. But also, it sounds like not only from a customs perspective, but also from a VAT perspective, that this is a dynamic sort of implementation going on, as you mentioned, that because now what individual country regimes are doing from a VAT perspective matter, and it's not just as uniform anymore, as sort of countries are changing how they're approaching facilitations, whether it's for the UK specifically or third countries generally. It's not a static situation. You're on mute, Richard.
Yes. Yeah. Well, firstly, what I would say, I think this is everything that's going on now has just exposed that the EU customs and VAT regimes, everything is just not constructed to have such a large third country trading partner in the way that the UK became when it was inside the EU. So I'm very sympathetic towards the tribulations that was having. I'm a bit more empathetic maybe than Peter is. I've spent a lifetime trying to understand international VAT, and I learn something new every day that's being imposed upon EU and UK businesses. I think in terms of the first question, I did touch on this. The problem is particularly for e-commerce, but all sectors. If you're a medium-sized business or a small business, and woe betide you if you're a micro business, then the VAT extra registrations, the loss of those simplifications, particularly as I say on e-commerce, but affects B2B as well, is and then throw in the tariff problems. Suddenly, everybody realizes that actually they're dealing in third country goods that have been imported from Bangladesh or China into the UK, and then they sell them on to the EU. So throw in those tariff problems, throw in the declarations. Then simply what we're seeing is a whole layer of small micro businesses whose business model now is rendered close to uneconomical. And that's where the real pain is. And, you know, it breaks my heart every day to be replying to people, and all our teams to be replying to people saying, no, there is no simplification around what this, you have to pay, you have to get extra VAT registrations, you have to get a fiscal representative, you've got import VAT to worry about, and if you can't do that, then yeah, perhaps you're going to lose 20% of your income. I think on your last point about how dynamic it is, I think the EU's gone hardcore on us in Europe and imposed third country rules blanket, and that's the tough piece. There's been very, very limited flexibility. The one area we've seen is around when I was mentioning around fiscal representatives. They're which is an expensive and painful process to go through, even though it sounds rather arcane. And some countries, there was a clause within the trade and cooperation agreement that effectively meant it wasn't required. It's called a mutual assistance protocol, which basically means HMRC will help the French tax authorities if any VAT goes missing by a UK business that's owed in France. Nevertheless, a lot of countries are not immediately accepting that, waiting for some interpretation. So I think they're being really tough. So it's assume the worst. I think the last point then, just before I hand over, and I think this is, it's not just the businesses, it's the freight businesses as well, the carriers who are struggling. So the latest problem that we're seeing is a lot of people have been using, I better not name names, but they're the biggest freight forwarders in the business to get their goods into Germany or to France. And unbeknown to them, the freight forwarders have been bringing the goods into Netherlands and Brussels. Now, I'm sure you'll all know they're the biggest, or some of the biggest clearing ports into Europe, got very favorable VAT regimes and obviously fantastic transport. But what they've been doing is they've been clearing the goods into the EU customs regime and into the EU VAT regime in those countries, and then transporting them to France and Germany. And they shouldn't have been doing that. They should have waited till the goods arrived in the country of importation. And so and this is the latest hot issue. There's too many of them to count at the moment. We're getting a lot of calls at the moment from people who've been using some of these big brands of carriers saying, I suddenly have Dutch VAT. What on earth do I do with that? And it's very painful process. So my point is, it's awareness right across the chain that's causing the problems.
Yeah. And just the last brief question I have, Richard, before I hand back to Bill, is I've been surprised by the amount of businesses I've encountered who, despite this being announced quite early on by the government, weren't aware of, as facilitations go, the postponed accounting for VAT, not only for EU imports, but for non-EU imports. Are you seeing businesses either aware of or availing of that much?
I'm glad you asked me about that, because when I did my little speech, I came off realizing I hadn't mentioned that. So I mentioned at the top, there's two big problems: loss of VAT simplifications, but also import VAT. And as Ali says, the UK has introduced postponed VAT accounting. That's a fancy name, meaning essentially, if you've got a UK VAT number and you're importing into the UK, you don't have to make the cash payment for the import VAT. You can defer it into your VAT return, and it just becomes essentially a bit of double entry bookkeeping. No is the answer. I get lots of questions, particularly from foreign businesses. Can we use it? And the answer to that is yes, you can. So again, we're seeing a lot of problems with the freight companies, the companies that are clearing the goods on behalf of the importer, whether it's a UK importer or an EU importer importing into the UK, not collecting the VAT number of the importer, the declarant, and therefore they're paying the import VAT over to HMRC. Now, if the paperwork isn't done properly, then when that bill goes through to the importer, the UK or EU business, they won't be able to recover that. So I think there's there's a nasty shock in for a lot of businesses on import VAT. Sorry, I should have said as well, lots of EU companies have the same postponed VAT accounting, we call it. Some don't, so keep an eye out, make sure you're importing or clearing into the right country.
Thanks, Richard. I'll hand back over to Bill now, although I'm sure there might be one or two things in any further questions that the other two might want to pick up on what some of the things that Richard was talking about. I'm glad we don't have some of the big boys on the freight forwarders on the call necessarily, but Bill, back to you.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, panel. I have noticed a number of people have dropped out because we are overrunning quite badly, but we will see what we can do. If I can have the next slide, please, Helen. I'm just going to rush through this stage, if I may, and try and get a few questions in. Some people have asked us, what is the BASDA Brexit or post-Brexit working party? I'm not going to go through every line here. We've been working steadily for the last few months, trying to feed information through to our members. If I can have the next slide, please, Helen. We're trying, as everybody is in the UK and probably the rest of Europe, to work out what the impact is of the trade agreement. And as Richard has very eloquently told us, and please, Richard, if you've got that in any form of notes that you're prepared to let us circulate, let us have them later, and we'll circulate them with the slides on VAT changes. We're all trying to work out what's happened, why is it happening. We're trying to get around the issues of Northern Ireland being a special case. We, as a membership organisation, our members are trying to help our clients who generally, and this is generally, and it's a terrible indictment, probably 70–80% of calls coming through to help desk are about information that is readily available from government. And has been available for some time. So our help desks are being overloaded, and Steve has indicated much the same as well. But we will continue to make information and resources available for our members. The IoD website, we've stopped doing our own resources. We point to the IoD website in terms of information relating to post-Brexit and Brexit issues. So I would encourage anybody to go there. If I may have the next slide, please. If you have to leave, we're very sorry, but we will continue to provide information to you. We will give you the full recording and the full set of slides if you do have to drop out of this because of time. I'm not going to go through this slide, but when I saw it, and another one that we will be circulating as well as a PDF, I perhaps naively, and I'm not new to business, I perhaps naively thought, well, yeah, we've got Brexit, we know what all the agreements are, we've got a trade agreement, well done government on the 24th of December, a bit late, but better late than never. This slide shows that there are things that are still yet to be decided, and those things go up to 2030. So it is going to be quite dynamic over the coming weeks, months and years. And there will be continuous change. It's not a done deal. And on that depressing note, I'd like to now move over to questions, if I may, please, Helen. Kevin was going to very kindly pick up any questions that came through at this time and present them to us if he could. If not, if somebody puts up their hand, I'm more than happy to take the questions. But I do have some questions, as the old expression goes, carefully prepared earlier. I do not want to spend more than 5 minutes on this because that will take us to 1:45, and I know other people have other appointments out there. If there are any questions out there, Kevin, did you get any?
Nothing in as yet that hasn't been dealt with during the sessions, Bill.
Okay, well, let me start with a question. I'm not sure anybody can answer it, and we know we have a Northern Ireland Protocol. We're trying to understand what it is. Is it a temporary measure or is it going to be indefinite? Thank you for smiling, Richard. Does anybody know the answer to that question? You know, are we looking at 5 years or ad nauseum, or unless the islands combined, if that were to ever happen, or the Republic leaves the EU? I don't know. Are we going to have to deal with it?
I'm smiling because I know Ali's itching to answer that.
More, I'm not going to even touch the what happens if it becomes a united country. I'll leave that for the politicians to polemic about. It's more actually that inbuilt into the protocol is a mechanism of consent, as they call it, and I won't go into too many details of how that's arrived at, because that's political enough in itself of a discussion. But basically, it requires, I think, every 4 years, the sort of effective sign-off from a certain sort of majority in the Northern Ireland Assembly to carry forward. So technically, it is there's a review mechanism therein.
Okay.
But what the other thing I would say just briefly on that is that in terms of the actual content of the agreement, when I last looked, it may not be there. This was probably particularly relevant if there were tariffs between the UK and the EU, but there aren't. However, the sort of mechanism for defining sort of the at-risk good guidance, I don't think is still fully there yet. So there's still pieces in addition to various grace periods for Northern Ireland GB tribe that are expiring in April. There's still more to come, so to speak.
Okay.
I think what we've seen is it's an incredibly complex process. And people generally don't understand it and haven't really come to, worked out the full implication of it is. But I think we're already seeing quite significant diversion of trade, and I think that'll continue. So I can't see any alternative other than tweaking. Well, tweaking. I think it needs overhauling quite dramatically. To retain the status quo prior to Brexit. It just doesn't work as it is at the moment in the real world.
Okay. One of the.
Can I ask? We've got a question in from Tim. If I use verbatim, what is the best idiot's guide to the new VAT regime, including excise?
Richard, is that something you could address?
Yeah, when it comes to idiots and VAT, I'm your man. We have, I apologize, I should have put it up. I can put it in the chat. We have, we call it a hub, and there is a plethora of webinars with lots of experts in VAT who explain what's changed. It covers Northern Ireland. There's a really interesting table. It's the most read page ever on our website, which covers all the scenarios for Northern Ireland, how to report it, etc. And maybe if I forward that on, that can be circulated to the audience. It's just a simple URL. I think, and it's written by people who read HMRC and all the different tax authorities' websites, and then try and put it into Idiot's Guide English. And it's you'll see it. It's structured by industry, so B2B, B2C, services, goods, etc. And it's constantly being updated with blogs, 2 or 3 a day as we learn new things. So maybe if I can send that through. I'll try and put it in the chat now.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
I am mindful of time. I am mindful of the fact that I have about half a dozen questions here, and we've lost at least half our audience so far. So I'm actually going to bring it to a close, and apologies for those who don't get their questions answered. Ali, Steve, Richard, Peter, thank you very much for taking the time, your valuable time today, to help us and everybody else on the session. Your openness and updates have been appreciated, if a little depressing on occasions, but that's inevitable. I'd like to thank everybody that's still left on this session for your active participation and engagement throughout the event. Without you, we're not going to hold these events. We will make the presentation slides, the recording, the URL that's just been mentioned by Richard, another document that I referred to dealing with timelines associated with what's next, what's got to be agreed within the next few days. And again, I'd like to say thank you all for your attendance and participation. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Peter, very much indeed. And enjoy your weather in Washington, Ali.
I think snow soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.